Joining us. My name is Daryl Urbanski, your host as always, and today we are joined by a very special guest, MD, MDMS, Robert W. Malone, inventor of the core mRNA and DNA vaccine technology. He's a worldwide expert in RNA technologies. He's the CEO of RW Malone, MD, LLC, consultancy and analytics in the biosector. He's a C-suite coach, expert witness, also does commercial intelligence. He also builds and manages teams to solve complicated problems in this space. So in 1989, he published a paper titled, I'm going to butcher this, cationic liposome mediated RNA transfection, and he went on to get over 9 patents in the field. So I've asked him to join us here today so we can talk about mRNA vaccines, the current state of the world, and hopefully shed some light on what's going on. You said there's lawsuits in the works. We just saw, if those that didn't see, there's been billion-dollar settlements for these companies that have clearly done criminal and civil offenses, from kickbacks to marketing drugs that are known to be dangerous. What should have, I guess I should ask, what, as the inventor of the technology, what would need to happen for it to have been fully ready for humans to take it? The mRNA vaccines that are the COVID vaccines that are out right now.
And let me just restructure that just a little bit.
Sure.
Here in the States, we have 3 vaccines that are either emergency use licensed or tentatively market authorized. The BioNTech product is not actually on the market yet because it's the same as the Pfizer product mostly, but it's technically a different product because it has new labeling and packaging and things like that.
Okay.
So really we have 3 vaccines. They're all genetic vaccines. They're all based on gene therapy technology. They all express exactly the same protein for the most part, which is the spike. And it's the intact spike with 2 amino acid modifications in the receptor binding domain that lock the receptor binding domain, fancy words for your audience. That's the part of the spike protein. The purpose of the spike protein is to allow the virus to bind its target cell and to insert or kind of inject the genome of the virus into the cell that's being infected.
Right.
So that's what spike does. And so it's got these 2 functions, and it undergoes a structural change in order to do that. I like to use my 2 hands. There's actually 3 subunits that come together. So if you think of my arms as the stalk, and then there's this head bulbous area, you see it on all the pictures of a coronavirus.
Right.
And represents spike. And the binding part is out here on my fingertips that recognizes the receptor that it binds to. And they move around, flop around, open up, go upside down. They move all around.
Yeah.
And what's been done is to insert a 2 amino acid mutation into spike that makes it so that instead of flopping around and undergoing this conformational change for fusion with the virus, it locks it into an open conformation. And it was based on the assumption that the antibodies that will inactivate the virus bind, if you can think of this as catcher's gloves.
Right.
If that works for most of your audience.
Right.
So there's a pocket in the catcher's glove, and that's the pocket that the receptor, that the protein on the cell binds to. So think of it that way. That it's like a fielder's glove. It's more like a fielder's glove because it can be open or closed, right?
Right.
Okay. And so think about the guy in the outfield with the glove that's got big fingers and it's open or closed.
Right.
And so that when the ball hits it, you close it up and you don't lose the ball, right? So it's kind of like that, only they've introduced a mutation that's locked it into the open conformation so the glove can't close.
Okay.
And the assumption was that the antibodies were going to have to hit the binding pocket. So that's the pocket in the glove, right? That would stop. And so if they hit that binding pocket, then they'll make it so that the virus can't bind onto a cell. That's the whole underlying logic of all of these vaccines.
Okay.
Is they are exclusively trying to target inactivating antibodies from B cells that'll bind to that pocket in the glove and make it so it can't catch the ball, basically. Right. Okay, if you think of the ball as the receptor on the cell.
Yep.
So, okay, so this isn't going to work for your European audience that plays cricket, but hopefully people will get it.
That's okay.
So it turns out that's not true. There's been a ton of work since looking at monoclonal antibodies and various antibody preparations and where they bind on spike. And for the most part, they're binding here, right at the tip, or they're binding the backside, or they're binding at the junction between two spike proteins, okay?
Right.
So the whole idea for the mutation that was introduced, people say, oh, that mutation was introduced to keep spike from being toxic. No, in order to have done that, the people doing the bioengineering would have had to have a time machine, because it wasn't known at the time they were doing the bioengineering about these other toxicities associated with spike that we now know about.
Right.
Okay? So, and the FDA never forced Pfizer at all to go back and prove that the engineered spike was safe and did not have the biologic activities that the wild type spike has, the wild type being the kind that's actually on the virus. So just to disambiguate.
So
we don't actually know whether and I've been fact checked on this, but they kind of don't get the point. My statements in the Brett Weinstein podcast was that spike is a toxin. That is true.
Right.
It has been proven again and again and again. Native spike is a toxin. And so then they say, well, but the geniuses at NIH engineered it so it's not going to be a toxin. Well, that's interesting because they've never shown that. They've never said that was the reason they were doing it. And they would have had to know and acknowledge that it was a toxin way back then in order to be able to foreshadow that they would have to make this engineering. Last point on this thread is that with pharmacology and pharmaceutical development, I like to say that the rules of the French judicial system apply. You're guilty until proven innocent. And so you can't assert that that a given protein is safe and effective unless you do the hard work to show that, in fact, it's safe and effective. So I don't know why you're pulling these. These are other examples of issues.
And that's why because I want to ask, are these at all real concerns? So I feel like what you're saying is the vaccines help to fight this version of the coronavirus, but it might, what's the term? Would it make you, is it hypersensitivity? What's the term? Vaccine-induced disease enhancement? Is that a real thing? Is that something?
Thank you for using that. Thank you for using that term instead of antibody-dependent enhancement. Antibody-dependent enhancement is a subset of vaccine-enhanced disease and replication, which is the vaccinologist's worst nightmare. It's what we ran into with all prior attempts to develop vaccines against these coronaviruses, with two exceptions, those both being veterinary vaccines, both of which are administered intranasally. Yeah, and you can actually find clips from Tony Fauci warning about ADE, and the ADE warnings are written into the federal, the FDA comments that were the basis of the emergency use authorization. There have been no rigorous studies done about whether or not vaccine-enhanced disease is occurring. Despite the FDA saying that they should be done, the vaccine developers have chosen not to do them. The FDA hasn't forced them to do them. And though there is the one thing that your listeners need to understand is that it has become wicked hard to publish anything that goes against the dominant narrative.
Right, the dominant narrative.
So that's another thing that's come out, is that almost all of these publications that we've relied on to be providing objective truth are dependent on pharma money for advertising and sponsorship.
And pharma we've seen has just almost annual lawsuits of hundreds of millions of dollars So you, just to say that they've never been
So
able to
so
create.
in our
Oh, sorry.
you can't publish this stuff. It's just wicked hard, and so that's why you're not seeing it come out in the literature. And if you're an academic, why would you spend 6 months of heavy lifting and scarce dollars on trying to demonstrate something that you're not going to be able to get published?
Right.
It's crazy. You wouldn't do it. It's just,
So,
your investors understand this.
I want to clarify something you said before. You were never able to create a safe vaccine for a coronavirus in the past, except for 2 exceptions.
Feline infectious peritonitis and bovine coronavirus are both veterinary vaccines.
Right.
And they're both considered kind of crummy vaccines by the veterinarians.
Right.
But those 2 did manage after a long, one of the things that's nice about veterinary vaccines that you can't do with humans really is that you can challenge the animals with lethal doses of virus, and it's ethically acceptable. It's obviously not ethically acceptable to challenge human beings with lethal doses of virus.
Right.
And the truth is that because of the nuances of the ACE2 receptor and the TMPRSS protein that activates the virus once it's bound, because of those nuances, humans have different affinities in their ACE2 for this virus than other animals do. And so basically, we don't have an animal model that's really worth much. The phrase "a tinker's dam" comes to mind, other phrases too. So we can't do the challenge studies in the way that we would love to be able to do, because we end up, just like with AIDS, with very artificial systems, like using the virus that Murray and Preston Marks identified years ago and related viruses to challenge monkeys, or human, basically gain of function versions.
Right.
To do those studies, and they're still not conclusive, and we still don't have an AIDS vaccine. So in this case, I don't want to give your investors a sense that there's no hope on the horizon for a decent vaccine.
No.
These vaccines are first generation, and they, in their rush to get something out the door, they focused on the low-hanging fruit, which was spike, as a single antigen. And there are multiple other vaccines in development, and some even licensed. And full disclosure, I'm involved in one of those being advanced in India by a company called Reliance, owned by a gentleman named Mukesh Ambani. You can look him up. You'll find he's one of the wealthiest people in the world, and Reliance is the largest conglomerate in India. Something that most Americans don't recognize is that there's actually a huge financial horizon in India, and their Indian vaccine developers are really good. I think that the vaccines industry and pharmaceuticals industry in India will come to dominate global supply over the next decade or so. So that's a news you can use.
Sure.
But the team that I've been helping coach at Reliance now has obtained allowance to begin phase 1 studies. And that vaccine, just to give an example, is a much more traditional vaccine. It's manufactured in mammalian cell culture and in E. coli in bacterial culture.
Right.
It's purpose designed to be extremely low cost, because Mr. Ambani wants to be able to vaccinate the rural poor in India. And, 1 billion people at even $10 a dose, that adds up to some real money.
Very, very fast.
Right. So that's his goal, is to be able to provide a product that will be safe and effective. And in that case, that product expresses 2 different proteins. It's a subunit of spike, the receptor binding domain. It's not the whole protein, so it doesn't have these biologic activities.
Right.
And it's also a subunit of one of the other core matrix proteins, the nucleocapsid protein associated with the virus. And so it has a broader antigen range, and we'll see how it works.
Yep.
And it's adjuvanted with more traditional adjuvants, alum and CPG. So that's something, that's one of many examples of second generation vaccines that are going to be coming onto the market. And in terms of, I don't want to pump, my full disclosure, I'm on retainer to Reliance Vaccines.
Sure.
But so I'm not pumping Reliance. They're one of many examples. But if your investor community is looking for new horizons, they may be wanting to look at next generation products, not necessarily at these products. I think there was, as I recall, there was an announcement by Pfizer to stockholders that they should expect that this current vaccine loses its effectiveness at something like 6 months from now.
So vaccine only lasts for about 6 months. We're almost at the top of our time.
Well, I'm talking about not only the durability for you, I'm talking about the overall efficacy of that vaccine will fall below acceptable limits because of the escape mutants that are being generated.
Right. There's over 100 variants right now, right? There's something like 5+ variants a week they're talking about.
So we now know that this virus is mutating at a higher rate than we had expected.
Right.
And there's some nuances here. The thing about vaccinating into an outbreak when you already have a whole lot of people with virus is that what you do is you got to kind of remember Darwin and natural selection.
Yeah, evolution.
You'll select for escape mutants.
Right.
The easy way for everybody to understand this is the overuse of antibiotics in the livestock industry.
It's created superbugs.
Is correct. Okay, so you can think of this as we're creating a super virus bug through the selective pressure of mass vaccination when we don't need to vaccinate everybody.
Everyone. Right.
We really only need to vaccinate the people at highest risk. And then the virus would be subjected to the natural immune systems of everybody else, where you have a probability of dying of, a tiny fraction of a percent.
Right.
And that is only that high because the government, in its infinite wisdom, has seen fit to make it impossible for docs to actually practice medicine.
And actually try different treatments.
Yeah, recognize and start implementing them. We've been trying them for 1.5 years now. We know a lot of things that work. The situation, like with famotidine and celecoxib, famotidine is over the counter. You can all buy it. It's called Pepcid. And celecoxib is called Celebrex. A lot of you use that for your arthritis. So the combination, and it turns out that Celebrex blocks COX-2. By the way, aspirin blocks COX-1 and COX-2. We don't recommend aspirin because there's been some history of adverse events in respiratory diseases with aspirin, and it's basically blocking too much of your immune response.
Right.
But there are papers out there showing that high dose famotidine, so high dose Pepcid plus aspirin, actually is pretty effective.
Right.
So there's a bunch of these drugs. The government has actively blocked their deployment and blocked the ability of physicians to use them. And it seems that the logic is that they perceive them as competitive with vaccination, that if these drugs are available, people won't accept vaccine.
Right.
Well, because why would that be? Well, because the vaccines aren't perfectly safe and they aren't perfectly effective.
Right.
One of the things that's kind of become increasingly apparent. So that's kind of where this is going. And it's unfortunate that we've all been blocked, but we probably have. There are credible estimates of hundreds of thousands of Americans unnecessarily dying because of mismanagement of the clinical disease, point being that rate of death in the average population of something in the range of 0.002, 0.001% risk of death if you're not in the super high risk groups, that's actually artificially high because we haven't been able to deploy early treatments. If we had it would be lower. And that's part of the reason why here in the States, our death rate, our mortality per case of hospitalized COVID is higher than just about anywhere else in the world.
Right.
What we should be doing is keeping people out of the hospital in the first place. So any of you that have had this experience or your relatives, what's been happening is you go to the emergency room, you say, doctor, I'm sick. I can't breathe very well. And they test your blood oxygen and they say, you aren't yet at the threshold of having blue lips. Go home and come back. And you say, but doctor, is there anything, come back when your lips are blue? Functionally, that's, having a blood oxygen lower than 80.
And that's it.
Or
Go to the
lower than
hospital when
90.
you're on your deathbed.
Yeah, exactly. And if you haven't been vaccinated, I mean, there's things like the Toronto Star headline the other day that basically say, well, if they weren't vaccinated and they come to the hospital, you should just let them die.
Right.
I'm shocked by all of this, but the truth underlying all of this is that there have been good repurposed drug therapies, and American physicians are blocked from using them. They're blocked from being able to practice medicine under threat of losing their license. You're only allowed to practice in the way that the NIH says you're allowed to practice.
Right.
So that's where it's coming from. And essentially that equates to what Tony says is what goes.
Right.
Tony doesn't practice medicine. Tony's never treated a COVID patient. We got to get that through our brains. Okay. Well, and Tony is subjected to the incredible conflict of interest relationships with key stakeholders all across this space, particularly in the vaccines industry. He's tight as a tick with Bill Gates. And we've got a whole, Facebook and Zuckerberg is invested in vaccines.
Yep.
Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is their core portfolio is invested vaccines. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is one of the largest shareholders of J&J. These entities that we think of as benign and not having conflict of interest that are funding a lot of this propaganda campaign and these fact checkers and everything else, they all have significant conflicts of interest.
For sure. Well, again, we talked about the settlements of these pharmaceutical companies, and if they're paying $2 billion, $3 billion, how much money does it cost to buy someone? I mean, how much money would I have to give you to get you to say your tap water made you feel ill? You know what I mean? Or like some sort of shampoo made your testicles smaller.
My wife always says to me, if Pfizer had only realized how cheap you could have been bought, then they would have had none of this headache.
Right. So this is something, again, people are concerned. Should I get vaccinated? Why? That's really what a lot of people are concerned about. We haven't been able to get vaccinated because Vietnam didn't think they needed them and they were slow to get them. And now in the Philippines, you have to book like your schedule and all that stuff. But they're pushing everyone to get vaccinated.
Hold it. You're a great case study. Let me dive into that because I had a long conference call with a colonel that represented a group of 20 nations or entities in Latin America that have ties to the UN. Okay. And it was quite a tense phone call. He was pressing me. It was basically a consultation to help them devise policy. And there was translators involved, and I had to be on my tippy toes intellectually. Because I knew I was going to be influencing Latin American policy. And he made the case that it's not in the interests of these Latin American countries to vaccinate. The vaccines only last for a few months.
Right.
They require cold chains that they don't have.
Right.
Pfizer in particular has quite egregious contract terms.
Right.
And they just don't see it as making sense in emerging markets. The counter thread is that the Western nations are basically hoarding all the vaccine and super saturating all of their populations with vaccine unnecessarily and not making it available for the high risk groups in the rest of the world. So there's a lot of tension in this, and I got to say that the positions that Vietnam took and other emerging economies are taking, emerging economy nations, that they really don't want to buy into this carousel with the vaccines. There's a merit to those arguments, and I have to acknowledge that for those situations, there's a logic there that's sound. And now that we know that natural infection provides superior immunity, the idea that many of them are focusing on, many of these, for instance, Mako, ivermectin is over the counter.
Yeah.
And it's cheap.
Got it in the Philippines, got it in Vietnam, got it in the Philippines. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are good protocols out there that can be used for early treatment. And if you get on this thing early, you end up not going to the hospital in the first place.
Right.
So that kind of makes sense to me. And why we're not doing it here in the States, I just don't get it. And a lot of people are perplexed about this. And that leads to all the conspiracy thinking and the regulatory capture observations, because there's just so many things that don't make medical sense. They only make financial sense for the vaccine companies. So that leads to people speculating about, their minds go off into Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, and we can go down that rabbit hole for another 2 hours if you want.
Sure.
Not that we have time today, but there's a whole lot of stuff there that active minds trying to make sense out of the nonsensical legitimately will go down, trying to investigate those various alternative explanations. I try not to do that. I try to stay, based
Focus
on the
data
facts
and the
that
science.
I can demonstrate.
Yep.
Yeah. It's not my job to. I'm venturing into public policy a little bit with the op-eds that Peter Navarro and I are putting out in the Washington Times, but for the most part, I try to stay away from those. But for sure, in terms of emerging economies, there's a logic to saying, not for me, thank you very much. Now, here's the observation, and this is another one of the conspiracy Legos. There's a group of, I think, 5 different national leaders in Africa that have all said, made clear statements that they don't want to take vaccine, every one of which has been assassinated. Now, is that just circumstance or not? I don't know. I don't know African politics. I don't know what's going on there. But there's certainly, for those that are conspiracy minded, it's an odd coincidence.
Well, we don't even have to label them conspiracies, because there's just like real facts, and certain things are just very fascinating and interesting. And that's, having been involved in having created the baseline technology, that's why I'm really curious to know about this. Because if I did jujitsu for 6 years, trained with Hickson Gracie and a bunch of others, and and it's all about kind of, you do things to know their next move, right? So it's like it's almost like Wayne Gretzky said, when I play hockey, I go where the puck is going. And so there's all this push to cause everyone to get vaccinated, and these people disappearing and all these things like that. And it's not to try to get so much into it. It's to talk about the real facts. That's why I tried to use Zoom to show some stuff about, that the States is leading the way on this.
Yeah.
But they're clearly in it for profit. If you look at our life expectancy versus, I know we're up for time.
But let me leave you with one thing that relates to this thread that your audience will appreciate, I think. One of the things I've observed again and again and again through these outbreaks is that the WHO and CDC and public health leaders generally operate only on what they consider to be validated data. Now, that's starting to break down, and like with the triple jab, they're starting to get way out on the edge on things that they really don't have data for, and I think are risky, which is part of why there were these resignations at the FDA because of that. But in general, what you see, if I can put it in terms of your investor community, It would be as if someone only makes investment decisions based on what they consider to be fully proven data. Now, your investor community will appreciate that if they were to do that, they would get their clock cleaned every single time by momentum traders and those traders that are using a totally different approach, which is basically risk mitigation, looking for leading indicators, and watching for black swans. This is language that your community can appreciate. I know you can. Okay, I advocate that if there's anything we learn from this, it's that the World Health Community needs to start acting more like stockbrokers. They need to think like stockbrokers. They need to be looking for leading indicators. They need to be performing risk mitigation, and they need to be constantly surveilling the landscape for black swans, not 6 months behind the data because they're only going to react to things that are validated.
Right.
And that, I think,
at that point, you make money by being right, and by being right, you can't wait for success for census. I forget, Naval Ravikant had some quote like that, like you win and make money by being right first, and to be right first, you can't wait for everyone to agree.
Yes, precisely. And that is how we need to manage global public health in the time of outbreak crisis. Precisely. We need to think like stockbrokers. Right. And we need to put the infrastructure in place like the investment community has. I mean, think about the massive investment that's been made in AI, ML, and all the other toolkits to allow your investor community to make accurate predictions. Okay, why don't we we ought to have 10 times that infrastructure for public health.
Right, and that's where how do we not know they already do? And that's partially why things are being pushed. And I don't want to go down the conspiracy rabbit hole. I do want to ask.
I can tell you as an insider that they don't. Okay. There are movements afoot, and there are some. The CIA has advanced programs like Argus to try to do this. That's data mining, but it is just like with the investment community. The term is data fusion. The data come in from a whole lot of different kind of data streams of different formats, and it is wicked hard to integrate all of those into a comprehensive package, which is why folks like your community hire people like me, is to try to make sense out of all this stuff, because the only way you can really do it still, the ML DL stuff isn't good enough yet to be able to integrate all of the different disparate things that a human consciousness that's experienced can process. And they're not, the computational tools are not yet sophisticated enough to incorporate a lot of these risk scenarios.
Right.
But they may eventually get there. And, God bless us if they do. But by that time, the robots will rule the world, I think.
Right. Well, Elon Musk announced the Tesla bot. I don't know if you heard that. The Tesla bot, the iRobot bot's going to be here soon enough. He said it's not going to go faster than 5 miles an hour or something, so you could outrun it if you had to. Yeah.
No, if you hang out, it's fascinating to parachute into Silicon Valley. It's just like in DC. In DC, the ads are totally different. They're all about selling big contractors and beltway bandits. And if you parachute into Silicon Valley and listen to the radio, you get bombarded by ads for very sophisticated issues relating to the latest trends in computational technology and deep learning. And people in these different sectors have insights that are not generally available to the rest of us. But I guess that's why you do your podcast. Right. Now we're 15 minutes over, pretty close.
Yeah. I want to try to ask 1 or 2 rapid fire questions before we get off. And so one is, aside from the vaccine aside from the virus escaping the vaccines, could the mRNA spike protein cause issues with prion diseases? Can it pass? Can
So
the lipid
so that
nanoparticles, can they pass the blood-brain barrier?
so those are the honest truth is those are risks. We talked about risk mitigation and risk identification. And normally what's done is that we take the time to run those risks to ground before we start jabbing people.
Right.
But in the heat of battle, under the pressure of overloaded hospitals, we decided that it was okay to roll this out without solving all of those questions. And if you take as a working hypothesis that the vaccine encoded spike behaves akin to the natural spike, then you have to conclude that the next logical step in that is that natural spike does open blood-brain barrier, will let things get across into the sanctum sanctorum that normally are prohibited from going in, and the spike is cut loose from the expressing cells, and the vaccine developers were not forced to characterize where the product, the active drug product is going, and what cells it's delivering its payload into, and how long they make protein, and how much protein they make. None of those are known for any three of all three of these genetic vaccines.
So it sounds like if you don't need to take it, don't take it.
That's my logic, is that there are adverse events that are well documented, and it's important to remember that those adverse events that are documented have to pass through a filter. They have to be clinically significant. So, for instance, if you're a high-performing athlete, you may notice that your peers have a drop in their performance after receiving vaccine. And if you're out on the edge of your own performance, say you're a 30-something NFL football player, you may say, hey, I'm close to retirement, and the last thing I need to do is take a jab that's going to drop my performance by 3% or 5%. Those kinds of performance changes aren't clinically significant. So they don't show up in the CDC database, but people observe them. So that's why you've got footballers and track stars and such like saying, no, I'm not going to take the jab, because they are seeing in their peers modest decreases in functional performance after taking the jab, things that are subclinical. The other thing about a lot of these adverse events, it's right in the FDA's authorization letter for the BioNTech product Comirnaty, is that the CDC now acknowledges that their databases are not sufficient for detecting rare adverse events. They say it flat out. So this is something that I had said on Tucker Carlson a couple months ago, and everybody got their tails in a twist because Tucker just wants to take down the government, and Robert was supporting Tucker, and blah, 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 blah. Well, now it's actually written into the authorization letter that the very thing I disclosed on Tucker, which is that the VAERS database and the other CDC databases are inadequate for assessing these adverse events. It's now officially in the FDA licensure package. So within 2 months we went from crazy Robert is throwing bombs that are fact checked to a federal document that validates everything I said, and that's happened again and again. So the problem is that with your question about should I take vaccine, the honest truth is I cannot point you to robust documentation that demonstrates what the spectrum of risks are. I know, and it's in the literature, that the risks are much broader than the ones that the FDA officially recognizes.
Right.
For instance, one of the more common ones is viral reactivation. How does viral reactivation happen? I don't know. It seems to be some inflammatory messaging that's happening post-vaccination. Can I assure you that the lipid nanoparticles aren't affecting ovarian performance or aren't affecting placental performance? No, I can't, because we don't have the data. and anybody at the CDC who claims otherwise is lying. I mean,
Right.
they're misleading. We can use whatever euphemism you want.
Right.
But they don't have the data to support that, so they shouldn't be saying those things. And so I can't say to you, hey, here's your risks for vaccine based on, if you fill out this little thing on your personal device, and then I can run it through a machine learning tool and give you a risk of what are your risks for adverse events and what type. I can't do that because the data don't exist to support that app on your cell phone. Now, there are apps for your cell phone that I've seen that are based on deep learning and machine learning data that can very accurately predict your risk of severe disease and COVID. Okay, and that's part of the toolkit that I'm recommending be deployed so that you can accurately judge for yourself at least what's the true risk for you personally to developing severe disease, being hospitalized, etc., if you were to get infected by the virus. Right. That's the kind of stuff that's available. Why we haven't had it distributed, that's another one of these big questions of, what are they thinking?
Well,
so I hope I've run that question, should I take the vaccine to ground? The answer is I can't answer it.
Right.
I can answer it really clearly. Go ahead.
If there's a synthesized misfolded protein, how would we know? If we were synthesizing
we
misfolded
wouldn't,
protein.
because the FDA has not forced the developers to do the heavy lifting in the rush to jam this out. And with all of the public messaging and PR, keep in mind that all of that propaganda that's being blasted out to the general public is also being received by all the bureaucrats and the folks at CDC and FDA. And they know darn well that their supervisors don't want bad news. So, if you don't want to, it's just shown by Marian Gruber for signing, because she got into a cat fight, apparently, with the CDC over the third jab. The way this works is you get in line with the diktat and lose your soul and your professional integrity, or you resign. Those are your options.
Wow.
And if you're working for the federal government, your primary driver is security.
Right.
Okay. You wouldn't take a job at 80% a market rate if you weren't focused on those bennies.
Right.
So all of this, I think a lot of this, we don't have to go to Klaus Schwab and the Great Reset. I think a lot of this we can explain by financial incentives, regulatory capture, and structural disincentives that exist within the system that ought to be fixed. So
is there another way to end this pandemic in a faster method than trying to rely on these vaccines?
Well, you can look up in the Washington Times. Peter Navarro and I have put out 2 op-eds to this point. And then I just did a long interview with Epoch Times. I know it's Epoch Times, and some people discount that. It's now the 5th largest publication globally. So that's coming out in American Thought Leaders. There's the first part of that interview just dropped last night, and you can find it. It is extensively footnoted. The references are in there, and what Peter and I have laid out is a 4-pronged strategy of vaccinate those that are at extremely high risk, provide apps that allow people to assess their risk so they can make their own decision about whether or not they want to take the jab. So empower people to assess their own risk. Make available early treatments. And the other part of this, in order for early treatments to work, we have to have home diagnostics. And they have those in Australia, by the way. The FDA and Tony Fauci have blocked their development here in the States and licensure, but the Aussies have them, and it's a quick diagnostic based on antibodies and other things. And you can tell whether or not you have been infected. And what we need is a rapid diagnostic home test that with all of the leakiness and flaws and false positives and false negatives that'll come with that strategy, but at least make it so that people have got to be able to be identified early on in the course of their disease, that they have the disease, so that you can begin therapy early on and keep you out of the hospital in the first place. So 4 things have got to happen. Vaccinate those that are at highest risk. Don't vaccinate everybody else. Provide early medicines, whether they're repurposed or the latest thing from Pfizer or Merck. I really don't care. But right now, the repurposed ones work pretty good as far as I'm concerned. Good enough that it would save at least 80% of the deaths.
And that's like ivermectin,
estimates.
chloroquine phosphate.
Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D. That's the protocols we're going to work out in Rome in a couple of weeks, okay, at the International COVID Summit. And we're actually going to speak about those protocols to the Italian Senate in Rome. Boy, put that on your bucket list. Get to address the Senate in Rome. So that's
on the back.
So that'll come out in a couple of weeks. And I don't think I have to wear a toga, but I'm going to wear a white lab coat.
Yeah, why not?
So watch out for the knives in the back. So I've been told. In any case, early treatment, existing drugs are pretty darn good. They're not perfect, but they're pretty darn good. Make available self-assessment tools, both for your risk for the disease and also whether or not you become infected and your risk for developing the more advanced disease. And we're going to have to kind of suck it up, put on your big boy pants. And this virus is going to move through the population, and that's just the way it is.
Right.
And
right.
And it will evolve, and hopefully it evolves to a less pathogenic, more highly infectious version, which is what is the usual course. Now I've got 6 minutes until the next one.
Okay.
And my wife has just bought me breakfast. So
I know. I'm so right. I'm so sorry. I just don't. I'd love to have you back. I don't know if I'm going to get you back. So I can ask the questions faster, but the last, I guess one of the last. No,
seriously, I got to drop.
Okay.
We're done.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for these answers. I do hope to speak to you again in the near future. Give your wife a big hug for me and everyone, and just have yourself a wonderful day. Take care.
Thanks. Ciao.
You've reached the end of our interview. Now, first, let me thank you for listening. I appreciate and respect you more than you'll ever know. And now I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. First, what 3 lessons did you just learn? What 3 aha moments just jumped out at you? Second, what can you implement for yourself and your business in the next 24 hours? Third, what can you give to someone else to help you with, or give to them to just do it for you? Whatever it is, remember, taking action is the secret sauce to results. Now, if you think this interview would be helpful for a friend, please give them a link to it. It'll help them and it'll help me too. I'd also like to invite you to help me find out more about the challenges you're facing, your dreams, your goals, and how I can help you overcome what's holding you back. We both do better when we know better, and your success is my success. So please reach out and interact. You can visit our website, bestbusinesscoach.ca for Canada or California, where I'm from and where I'm living. You're welcome to also try out one of our paid programs. You can find us on YouTube, Facebook, and pretty much every other social media channel you can think of. You should also subscribe to the podcast, and if you're enjoying them, please leave us a nice review. It really helps. That's all for now. Once again, thank you. Take care of yourself, and remember, the world needs the best business you can build. And I believe in you.
So look, I was privileged enough to sit in the room the other day and listen to Daryl present.
I had the great fortune to spend some time with Daryl Abrinsky during this week, and we had an incredible 2.5-hour presentation with Daryl.
Daryl was amazing. I got so many little nuggets of wisdom.
I hadn't heard Daryl speak before, but what struck me from his presentation was
he's one of these hidden masters in the internet marketing world who's worked on some pretty incredible launches.
Daryl has a ridiculous amount of knowledge. Daryl Urbanski's presentation was absolutely great. I really loved
An incredible knowledge of numbers. He is a very articulate, very knowledgeable, very advanced marketer.
Well, he talked a lot about keyword tools and how to research your niche.
So it really created a lot of predictability around moving forwards in our business with the marketing and sales aspect, which is so important to any business to really see it grow.
Where he walks you through step by step
How to judge in detailed form how much money you could potentially make from a market based on AdWords, keyword research, and putting together quite complex Excel spreadsheets.
And what I took away from it is not only understanding your niche market, but also looking at and breaking down and going, am I working with the right niche? Is there enough demand there for me to be able to reach my goals? And doing that hard research.
There's a lot of gurus out there that present you a lot of the why and the what, but they don't necessarily give you the how. And what I really found with Daryl's presentation, there's no holding back. There was no holding back the screens or the curtains. Like, everything was given to really assist us.
His feasibility and due diligence is incredible, and he was able to show us in a really short space of time how to cut through the overwhelm.
You're giving us the exact tools that we can use to test something before we even go to start testing it by spending money on it.
One of the biggest nuggets that I got out of his presentation was that when people pay, they pay attention, and when people pay a lot, they pay a lot of attention. I just love that. I think that's a great way to look at how to price yourself.
And he was a great speaker, lots of energy, and it was really great to spend time with him.
Honestly, phenomenal presentation.
I would love to catch up with him, next time I'm in this part of the world.